More fallout from Donald Trump's threats to delay the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Now we're learning the owners of the Ambassador Bridge may have had a high-level conversation moments before that now infamous social media post.
Canada's most important trade route to the United States is changing. Not because of a shutdown, neither because of a strike, nor because Ottawa announced some grand new trade plan. It changed because trucking companies ran the numbers, and the numbers told them to move. For decades, the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit was the dominant commercial crossing between Canada and the United States. It was the bridge, the backbone of North American manufacturing, the route that carried auto parts, machinery, components, and billions in daily trade across one of the most important industrial corridors on the continent. But now, that dominance has been broken. Traffic has shifted north toward the Blue Water Bridge between Sarnia and Port Huron. And the reason is brutally simple: lower tolls, smoother routing, less wasted time. This is not just a bridge story. It is a warning about the entire Canada-US trade relationship. Because when one route becomes too expensive, too unreliable, or too politically exposed, companies do not wait for permission. They reroute. And right now, Canada is learning that same lesson at the national level. When one route becomes unreliable, you build another one. That is the whole story in one sentence. Now let's break down what happened. For generations, the Ambassador Bridge was not just a crossing but a system. The Windsor-Detroit corridor sits at the heart of North American automotive manufacturing. Parts can cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the assembly line. That means speed, prediction, and minutes matter. In a just-in-time supply chain, even a 20-minute delay can create expensive consequences across factories, warehouses, and assembly lines. That is why the Ambassador Bridge became so powerful. It was close to the factories and familiar to carriers. It was embedded in the logistics habits of an entire continent. But logistics does not reward history forever. It rewards efficiency. And once the efficiency equation changed, the old route started losing its grip. The first signs were easy to dismiss. A little more traffic through Sarnia, a little less through Windsor. A few companies testing another route with nothing dramatic. But then the pattern kept repeating month after month, quarter after quarter. And by 2025, the numbers made the shift impossible to ignore. The Blue Water Bridge recorded about 2.1 million commercial truck crossings. The Ambassador Bridge recorded about 1.9 million. For the first time in decades, Windsor was no longer the busiest commercial truck crossing on the Canada-US border. And the trend did not disappear in early 2026. It continued. That matters because in logistics, one good month can be noise. But repeated movement across multiple quarters is not noise. That is behavior changing at scale. So the first lesson is simple. The Ambassador Bridge did not lose dominance because it disappeared. It lost dominance because another route became cheaper, smoother, and easier to trust. And when the math changed, the trucks moved. Now, why did they move? It was for two reasons: cost and time. The Ambassador Bridge has been significantly more expensive for many commercial users than the Blue Water Bridge. For a standard 5-axle truck, the difference can add up to roughly around $100 per crossing, depending on the rate structure being used. Now, $100 does not sound like a revolution. One truck, one trip, one crossing, fine. But trucking companies do not operate like that. They run fleets. They cross borders repeatedly. They calculate every toll, every liter of fuel, every driver hour, every delay, and every avoidable cost. $100 saved once is small. $100 saved hundreds of times becomes strategy. $100 saved thousands of times becomes a new trade route. That is how the map changes. not with one dramatic announcement, but with dispatchers, spreadsheets, and route planners. With companies asking the same question every morning: which crossing keeps us moving and costs us less? And increasingly, the answer was not Ambassador. It was Blue Water. But cost alone is not enough. Time matters too. The Windsor-Detroit corridor is dense and urban. Trucks using the Ambassador Bridge face more city traffic, more congestion, and more unpredictable delays before reaching the highway network. The Blue Water Bridge has a different advantage. It connects more directly into major highway systems, with Highway 402 on the Canadian side and key Michigan routes on the American side. That creates a smoother freeway-to-freeway movement. And for logistics companies, smooth movement is money. A longer route can still win if it is cheaper and more predictable. That is the second lesson. Trade does not move according to tradition, but according to the route that makes the most sense today. And today, many companies have decided that the Blue Water route makes more sense. So here is the recap before we go further. This is not about emotion, not about loyalty to one bridge, but about nostalgia for the old corridor. It is about math, lower costs, fewer delays, and better predictability. That combination shifted traffic north. But here is where the story gets bigger. Because Blue Water may be winning today, but the next major disruption has not even fully entered the system yet. That disruption is the Gordie Howe International Bridge. The Gordie Howe Bridge is not just another crossing, but a direct challenge to the old order. It was designed to modernize the Windsor-Detroit corridor, add capacity, create redundancy, and give North American trade a new publicly owned option in a corridor that had long depended heavily on one private bridge. In plain English, the Gordie Howe Bridge is meant to solve many of the problems that pushed trucks away from Windsor in the first place. We are talking about better infrastructure, more modern design, a direct freeway-to-freeway links, a more competitive routing, and the possibility of lower or more competitive tolls. That means the Blue Water Bridge may not be the final destination of this shift, but the first stage. Because once Gordie Howe opens, trucking companies will run the numbers again. And if the numbers change, the trucks will move again. That is what makes this moment so important. The old map is not being replaced by one new fixed map. The whole system is becoming more competitive. For decades, the Ambassador Bridge looked unavoidable. Now it has to compete. Blue Water has already proven that companies will reroute if the economics work. Gordie Howe could prove that Windsor can win traffic back, but under a new model, with new infrastructure and new pricing pressure. So the real question is not simply whether Ambassador loses or Blue Water wins. The bigger question is what happens when all three crossings are competing at the same time. That is when the map of North American trade could change again. And that is where politics enters the story. Because the Gordie Howe Bridge is not just an infrastructure project anymore. It has become a political flashpoint. Donald Trump's threat to delay or block its opening turned a shared economic asset into a dispute over leverage, ownership, and power. Canada's position has been very clear. This bridge was built under an existing agreement. Canada financed the construction, including the bridge, plazas, highway connections, and supporting infrastructure. Michigan receives joint ownership and a share of future toll revenue once Canada recovers its investment. In other words, this was not some hidden arrangement, it was negotiated, approved, and designed to benefit both sides of the border. Yet, once Trump framed it as America being taken advantage of, the bridge stopped being treated only as infrastructure. It became a symbol, which is dangerous. Because bridges are not just symbols, but physical systems that keep supply chains alive. If you threaten a bridge, you are not just threatening Canada. You are threatening the flow of goods into Michigan, threatening automakers, and threatening factories. You are threatening workers whose jobs depend on the border functioning smoothly. That is the part that gets lost in the political noise. Tariffs, bridge threats, trade pressure, do not stay on the Canadian side of the border. They travel through the supply chain, land on American companies, land on American workers, and on consumers too. So here is the next recap. The Ambassador Bridge fight is not just about one crossing. It shows three things at once. First, companies will reroute when the math changes. Second, new infrastructure can destroy old dominance. Third, political interference can turn a logistics problem into a continental risk. And that is why Canada should be paying attention far beyond Windsor. Because the bridge story is really a miniature version of Canada's wider trade problem. For decades, Canada's national economy has had its own version of the Ambassador Bridge. And for a long time, that route worked. But now, the route has become more politically exposed to tariffs, threats, USMCA uncertainty, border rhetoric, bridge disputes, and sector-by-sector pressure. And when one route becomes more expensive, more unpredictable, or more politically exposed, the lesson is the same. You build another route. That is what trucking companies did. And that is what Canada is now trying to do. Negotiate Mercosur, engage with Europe, the Nordics, Asia, critical minerals, energy routes, defense industrial cooperation, and domestic capacity. These are not random moves, but different versions of the same logic. When one route becomes unreliable, you build another one. That does not mean Canada is abandoning the United States. It does not mean the US stops mattering. It still matters enormously, just as Windsor does. But importance is not the same as invincibility. The Ambassador Bridge was important and still lost traffic. The US market is important. But Canada is learning that overdependence on one route can become dangerous when that route becomes unstable. That is the Tradeconomics lesson. The old assumption was simple. If Canada depends on the route, Canada has to absorb the pressure. But the bridge story shows something different. Dependence does not always create compliance. Sometimes it creates adaptation. The moment the cost of staying becomes higher than the cost of moving, companies move. And countries start thinking the same way. That is why this story matters. Because it shows how trade systems really change. Not all at once. Not always through laws or speeches. But through thousands of quiet decisions made by people trying to protect margins, save time, and reduce risk. And once enough of those decisions point in the same direction, the old system changes before anyone officially announces it. That is what happened at the Ambassador Bridge. The system shifted first. The headlines came later. So where does this leave us now? Blue Water currently has the momentum. Ambassador is under pressure. Gordie Howe is waiting to become the next major variable. And the Windsor-Detroit corridor is entering a new era where no crossing can simply rely on history. Every route will have to compete on cost, speed, reliability, and political stability. That could be good for trade if it creates more redundancy and more efficiency. But it also creates risk if politicians treat infrastructure as leverage rather than as shared economic machinery. Because North American manufacturing does not need more uncertainty. It needs predictability, capacity, and routes that work. And it needs political leaders who understand that cross-border infrastructure is not a bargaining chip. It is the physical foundation of jobs, prices, production, and regional prosperity. So here is the real Tradeconomics take. Canada did not shift its trade route because of one speech but because the numbers changed. The Ambassador Bridge became too costly and too inefficient for too many carriers. Blue Water became the better option. Gordie Howe is coming as the next disruption. And Trump's threat turned an economic transition into a political fight. But underneath all of it is one simple truth. The map of North American trade is not fixed. It moves when cost changes, when time changes, and when trust changes. And right now, all three are changing at once. That is why this story is bigger than a bridge. It is a preview of the wider Canada-US relationship. When the old route becomes less reliable, companies reroute. When the old partner becomes more unpredictable, countries diversify. And when the math changes, the map follows. So here is the question that matters most. If Canada's most important trade corridor can shift this quickly once the numbers change, what happens when Canada starts applying that same logic to the rest of its economic relationship with the United States? Because when one route becomes unreliable, you build another one. And Canada is already doing exactly that. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening under the headlines, subscribe, share the video, and turn on notifications. At Tradeconomics, we follow the markets first, then expose the power mechanics underneath. Because the real story is never just the bridge, never just the tariff, and never just the headline. It is who pays, who reroutes, who gains leverage, and how the system quietly shifts before the public catches up. See you in the next one.